Now, class, we're coming to the end of this week's lecture. Before you watch this video, which is part 3, make sure you've seen parts 1 and 2 in sequence first. In part 3, we cover other considerations and miscellany with regard to cognitive and ability testing. First, we introduce the notion of adverse impact, which will come up a lot. It's an important notion that relates to how fair the testing is, demographically speaking. Then we briefly discuss issues related to testing cognitive ability online, which is a fairly common thing. Third, we cover some fairly dubious quote-unquote alternative intelligences that you may have heard of. And lastly, we finish up by discussing other ability tests that capture physical abilities. So, there are a couple of group differences that tend to emerge on cognitive ability tests. So, for example, black people score roughly a standard deviation lower than white people. This is US data. And this is fairly old US data. The most recent data is showing that the subgroup differences are shrinking, so now the standard deviation differences between black and white people in the US is more like half a standard deviation than a full standard deviation. So it's on its way down. There are structural changes that are making a very big difference. But there are some demographic differences that have been documented across, say, races, quote unquote. Of course, as we know, race is a social construct, but that is what we see in the data. So, what does that mean for recruitment and selection? What that means is, well, we encounter one of the great boogeymen in selection, which is adverse impact. Adverse impact refers to when selection is unfairly biased towards or unfairly prejudiced against specific demographic groups, whether we define demographics in terms of race, gender, age, LGBT status, etc., etc. Okay? Now, class, this seems strange, right? Because IQ tests are supposed to be objective measures. Why do these objective measures create adverse impact? Well, the truth, class, is that nothing is ever really objective, yeah? So, there's this fairly recent book, extraordinary book by Cathy O'Neill. It's called Weapons of Math's Destruction, which covered this in depth with regard to algorithms, yeah? So again, we assume that when people say, oh, we use an algorithm for selection, we use an algorithm for this and that these algorithms are inherently fair because they're objective. That is just not true, yeah? So the way these algorithms are created is through machine learning or multiple regression, and the thinking is that because we use these fancy AI big data thingos, that these data-driven algorithms must be objective, but they are not. Yeah, so for example, sentencing algorithms for criminals in the US disproportionately hand out longer jail sentences to black people than to white people, even though the algorithm knows nothing about the person's race, explicitly speaking. Why, class? Because race still shows up implicitly in the other inputs into the algorithm. So the algorithm decides sentencing on the basis of other stuff, like what's your postcode? What's your zip code? Did one of your parents go to jail? Do you have a previous arrest or misdemeanor? Now, all these things disproportionately tag black people and minorities more, and so they get disproportionately longer sentences than would be otherwise considered fair. Yeah, and so ironically, rather than having a judge use their judgment, decision-making discretion to decide the length of a sentence, you actually get less fairness by relying on an algorithm, right? And so we see that at play here. There's a deeper issue, class, at hand. Now, I've spent a number of lectures extolling the virtues of the scientific method and the importance of validity coefficients, but let's get real. You can't let validity coefficients decide everything. Yeah, so in HR and in psychology, this approach, which is letting data and only data rule your reasoning, it is called Dust Bowl empiricism. Yeah, and that's a pejorative term. Empiricism here referring to the focus on data and experience to drive decision making, and the Dust Bowl refers to the American Dust Bowl, which is where in the US this got popular, which was in Minnesota. One example of Dust Bowl empiricism gone very wrong is the MMPI, I think it's Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, which is a clinical test for psychological disorders. The creators of the MMPI let data decide which items are used to measure each disorder, which makes sense, yeah? So what you do is you have people fill out long surveys and then you clinically assess what psychological disorders they have and then look at the predictive validity for each item, predicting whether or not the person has that psychological disorder. It could be through predictive validity or concurrent validity. Either way, if the item correlates with, say, being depressed, then that's a good way to measure depression, yeah? It makes sense in principle, but in reality, class, it was a gigantic mess. For example, a measure of schizophrenia in the MMPI asked people whether or not they had back pain. Back pain, class. Do you have back pain right now? Do you? If you do, the MMPI would be more likely to say that you're schizophrenic. Yeah, the problem, class, was that there was some quirk in the sample, for whatever reason, that led schizophrenics to report having more back pain. Again, the back has nothing to do with the brain. It has nothing to do with paranoid delusions, okay? It's just a quirk in the sample. But this quirk made the item back pain show up with a high validity coefficient, when in reality it was entirely spurious. It was just an artifact of the sample. Yeah, so don't class, as important as validity coefficients are, it cannot and should not be the overarching principle that drives your selection package. So back to our adverse impact problem with IQ testing, there are some solutions. The first of which is not to rely only on ability tests. If you rely on a broader range of selection tools, you're able to balance out the adverse impact that is potentially generated by IQ testing. You can also use what's called Pareto analysis, which was popularized by Serena Wee, actually from UWA, showing that if you select on the basis of not just general mental ability, but some mix of specific cognitive abilities, you actually get much reduced adverse impact and still many of the benefits of cognitive ability testing. So the key is some balance between general mental ability testing and specific abilities. Now, class, I want to entertain a counter-argument that some of you might have. Let's use swimming as an example. We know also that swimming ability does vary by quote-unquote race. Yeah, so in the US, white people are more skilled swimmers, it's documented, on average than black people. Now, we do want a diverse set of lifeguards, but we also want the best swimmers to be lifeguards, yeah? So should we then abandon swimming tests because they create adverse impact, preferentially favoring one demographic over another, right? No, we shouldn't. The reason is that the swimming tests are not what's biased. That's not the problem here. The problem, which is to say the subgroup difference, is that different races have systematically different opportunities to learn how to swim, systematically different parenting, parental, social, peer, cultural, and economic factors that influence their access to swimming and training. So the problem, class, the issue is not with the test. The issue is structural. The issue is in the way society is organized. And so abandoning the swimming test will not make the societal problem go away. You want to keep the test, but also work on the underlying social problem. Now, let's briefly cover the use of cognitive ability tests online. For better or for worse, this is a fairly common thing. I've seen it used for selection to give people scholarships. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is used by DFAT, I think, for their graduate selection. It's a fairly common thing, class. Now, you and I know that conducting cognitive ability tests online, unproctored, without a proctor or invigilator present in front of you, creates some problems. So, you can have other people take the test for you. You can have accomplices sit the test with you and help you. You can have books in front of you to help you solve the problems. And there can be differences in computers, differences in internet speed that can all introduce noise and also make the test less valid. So generally, class, the consensus is that internet testing is more ideal for getting biodata, so basic demographic information on the worker, for situational judgment tests, and for personality tests. It is not ideal for cognitive ability tests. Okay, now some important utility considerations. Should general mental ability be tested for every single job? Now again, we don't only consider reliability and validity, we also consider utility. Is it useful, right, in terms of dollars and cents? Now recall, class, that the utility of a selection procedure depends on whether the selected candidate has a higher score on the selection procedure, or on the IQ test in this case, than the average person. Now what happens, class, if for whatever reason your selection pool is all mostly smart people? Then the difference between the smartest person and the average in the applicant pool may end up being fairly small because of range restriction. You're not getting the full range, the full diversity of cognitive ability from high to low. What you're getting is pretty much the top of the range and then selecting within that. Now, can you think of jobs in which that would be relevant? Think of jobs in which just being able to become an applicant requires you to jump through hoops that require high cognitive ability in the first place, or that even measure high cognitive ability. For example, if you're trying to hire a doctor, just to get into medical school, you have to score really high class on the GAMSAT. The GAMSAT is effectively, among other things, a test of cognitive ability. Persisting in med school and not dropping out requires high cognitive ability. And so, just getting to the end of that marathon, before you're even just getting to the stage where you're applying for a job, as a freshly graduated medical student, requires a fairly high cognitive ability. And so the difference between the person at the highest level and the average might not be very high, and so you might not get as much utility for this job because of the way people end up in the applicant pool. Okay, now some general recommendations from the textbook when choosing cognitive ability tests. Look at the reliability data. Ideally, you want reliability data from similar workers in similar industries to the extent possible, but often it can generalize. You also want to inspect the evidence for validity, which is to say, does the ability test measure what it is said to measure, and does it predict the criterion of interest? Now, let's talk about emotional intelligence. You must be wondering, well, we haven't spoken about emotional intelligence yet. It has intelligence in the name. Surely it must matter. I'm gonna defer here to Adam Grant, HR superstar, and let him explain for me. Yeah. So in this article on LinkedIn, which you can easily look up, entitled "Emotional Intelligence is Overrated," Adam Grant explains that really emotional intelligence has very low predictive validity, which is close to zero after accounting for cognitive ability. So here's an example from sales. Now you would think in sales, for someone to be good at sales, they would need to be emotionally intelligent. And yet, I'm going to read the quote on screen. Working with Dave Barnes of Optimize Hire, we gave hundreds of salespeople 2 validated tests of emotional intelligence that measure their abilities to perceive, understand, and regulate emotions. We also gave them a 5-minute test of their cognitive ability, where they had to solve a few logic problems. Then, we tracked their sales revenue over several months. Cognitive ability was more than 5 times more powerful than emotional intelligence in predicting the criterion, which is in this case actual dollar value sales. So, for the group with highest cognitive ability, they had far higher sales, 195 grand compared to 159 grand for those with moderate cognitive ability, and far lower for those with low cognitive ability. Emotional intelligence added nothing after measuring cognitive ability. There's more information on this class in the article, and Adam Grant does explain when emotional intelligence, when it is useful to know how emotionally intelligent you are. Fine, that's okay. Yeah, it's not completely worthless. It is just not useful for selection. It just does not predict the criteria that count. Especially not after taking cognitive ability into account already. Now let's here another one is multiple intelligences. So we get this from education expert Howard Gardner. And the basic premise is there's a whole bunch of different ways. 9, it used to be 8, now it's 9 different ways to be intelligent, which is maybe you're good with nature, maybe you know yourself really well, or maybe you have good interpersonal skills, or maybe you're good with your body, or you're good with language, or you're good with music, or you're good with, spatial reasoning. Class, this is complete garbage. It is BS. It is bad science, class. Howard Gardner has gone on record in interviews saying that this was just a nice fancy idea he had as like a Harvard professor or whatever. Yeah, but it had zero basis in reality. No empirical evidence, class, has been mustered for the idea that we have 8 or 9 intelligences. It's just not true. It has no basis in fact. Now let's end briefly by discussing physical ability testing. The most common test used is Fleischmann's test, which covers 9 different physical skills, which are shown on screen: static strength, dynamic strength, explosive strength. These are all discussed in more detail in the text class. And these physical abilities show pretty good validity for certain kinds of jobs, specifically jobs that require a lot of physical ability, which you would know through job analysis. Now, let's end with some conclusions. We know that general mental ability is a valid predictor of on-job performance and arguably one of the best predictors of job performance. More so for highly complex jobs. But you must still choose a test that is reliable or valid. If it is not reliable, which is to say, if the test is noisy, then it is less likely to give you precise assessments of general mental ability. And if it's not valid, if it doesn't actually measure what it's supposed to measure in your population, then it is useless. So don't just pick any test on Google, because if you do and it turns out that there's adverse impact, there could be genuine legal consequences. That's it for this week's lecture, class. If you have any questions, just send me an email, and that's it.